When I was a graduate student in philosophy at Harvard, I decided that I'd take a leave of absence and go and live in Paris for a few years, but I didn't have any money. So I got a job as a junior psychologist, working with the team of psychologists who were asked by the administration of MIT to talk to returning vets from World War II who, when they came back to MIT, were having a lot of trouble adjusting. Nervous breakdowns, suicides, dropouts. And since I was a vet myself, I was recruited as an interviewer and talked to these vets and got a pretty good picture of what was troubling them and what MIT was doing inadvertently to add to the tension of their lives. And then we made our report, and I was very impressed by the eagerness with which and the interest with which the administration at MIT wanted to know the answers and took action. So that was very impressive. So later on, after a few years in Paris, when I came back to the United States and wasn't sure, I did not want to go back to the university. I didn't know what to do, and I remembered this work. And it seemed to me that practice of helping to interpret what people want from the institution that purportedly serves them seemed like an interesting kind of work. I didn't know whether it had any commercial counterpart, but I started looking for a job with that in mind. And eventually I got a job for an industrial design firm that wanted to do marketing research among customers, because the head of the firm said to me, for our architects and designers, a refrigerator is a big ice cube surrounded by useless space. And they don't know what housewives, how they use ovens and refrigerators, and how people use adding machines and other products we're being asked to design. So he had in mind what he called the concept of pre-design research, where you could try to find out from people how the products that they were designing could be of greater service to them. And that seemed like a reasonably good fit from both of our points of view. And so I joined that firm and stayed with it for a number of years. And it really set the pattern for the work that I've done ever since. Well, the organizations that I've founded, most of them follow a similar theme to the one I've just mentioned. The one exception is the very first company I started called The Door Store. I was living in Greenwich Village in New York, and I noticed that people like myself had a need for inexpensive furniture. And a friend of mine who was a wholesaler of a lumberyard, had 400 slightly damaged Philippine mahogany doors that they couldn't use for doors, but which could be used for tables and couches and things of that sort. So we set up a store in Greenwich Village and started to sell the doors, and then we sold wrought iron legs to go with them and other foam rubber cushions and so forth. And that later became a chain of stores. I sold out pretty early, but that was my only venture in what you might call real business. The other organizations will have more research, polling, trend analysis type organizations, about 5 such organizations. I'm retired from a lot of directorships that I held, but I still have a few. I'm still chairman of several of the organizations that I founded. One is a not-for-profit organization in New York called the Public Agenda that the former Secretary of State, Cyrus Vance, and I founded in 1975. So I'm still chairman of that. I'm also chairman of a small boutique research firm in Connecticut, DYG, and chairman of a small firm here in New York, in La Jolla, that I set up called Viewpoint Learning. And then I have advisory positions in the Concord Coalition. I'm on the UCSD Foundation board here. I'm on an advisory committee to Toyota and a few things of that sort. But most of my active business life is as a director and chairman is behind me. Well, probably this organization called the Public Agenda that Vance and I started, because it was an effort to bring a nonpartisan perspective to some of the issues that affect the election, that affect the nation. And so over the years, we've been deeply involved in issues of sustainability, education, issues, housing, all the full range of issues with which the country is struggling. Well, at this age, one of the personal goals is to stay alive a bit. I remember some years ago, I asked 2 of my friends who were then in their 80s, Peter Drucker and John Gardner, how they were doing as they got older, about the same age as I am now. And both of them said pretty much the same thing, which is we have fewer good hours, but the good hours we have are just as good as they used to be. I found that very encouraging, because it means maybe your threshold of energy might be reduced a little bit, but the vital time that you have is still vital. And so maintaining vitality for the coming years. And also the theme that has interested me my whole working life, which is to try to get a better understanding of the times in which we live, continues to be an interest and a concern all the time. Well, I think that there is a huge difference between starting a company and managing it. I remember a friend of mine who was a high-level executive at IBM criticized me once for coming up with too many ideas and said, you know, we've learned over the years that running a big enterprise like IBM is 95% implementation and 5% initiative and new ideas. So I think that understanding that difference is critical, and that the drive of an entrepreneur who is constantly flexible and changing and modifying things is a little different from the need to maintain a stability and growth that as it were, normal management. So I think that the recognition of a need, the proactive initiative to do something about it, and the flexibility in adapting to new circumstances seem to me to be critical elements of entrepreneurship. Oh, you bet. You know, then when you're young and just making a living, this is a capitalist society and you need capital. And if you don't have capital, then it makes it very difficult. And what I did in lieu of capital was being paid by clients in advance for a few projects, and that helped enormously. And they were willing to do that. My first client was the Swiss Watch Federation. I had done some work for them in earlier years, and they were quite willing to take on the new firm and give us a contract, and that served as our working capital. And you know, we went on from there. Well, for me personally, the greatest challenge is that how to balance my personal academic interests with making a living and running a business. The reason that I left the philosophy department at Harvard, I always felt I didn't leave it, it left me, in the sense that they were practicing a particularly sterile form of philosophy during that era. You know, it's what led to computer science. Computer science is a wonderful field, but it's not philosophy, as I've conceived it. And so there's always been a tradition of people doing philosophy without being in a university setting. When I started my own firm, I decided that I would call it by my name, Daniel Yankelovich Incorporated. And people said to me that I was living in New York, and they said, you know, you're crazy to do that because you're not going to get any clients from the conservative major corporations in the Midwest in any place except New York. So why don't you call it something else? And I said, well, I'm calling it by my name for a very special reason. Because once I started going, I want to go back to this book that I'm writing. And if I'm writing a book and people are, you know, saying, what do we need him for? He's only working part-time. Well, they would have a great deal of difficulty throwing me out if the firm is in my name. So that was the reason that I would call it by my name. Now, the irony of it is that for years, we never got a single New York client, and all the clients we got were these conservative Midwestern companies that everyone had said we would never get. So you never know the way life is gonna work out. So, you know, that was a constant balancing act of finding the time to do both. Well, I think for me, the part that comes easiest is problem solving. It's just sort of like people have various dispositions. And I remember, you know, a film, The Bridge on the River Kwai. You left these engineers by themselves and they build a bridge, whether it was for the enemy or for themselves or anything. They just couldn't help themselves. They build bridges. And I have the same reaction too when I confront a problem. So that part is the easy part. Routine administration, I find almost impossible. I don't have the patience for it. So that those are the sort of two aspects. Well, I think people need to understand their own biorhythm. And I find that I work best in the morning. So I've organized my life so that any writing and serious thinking I do is in the morning. And then a number of years ago, I took up yoga to relax in the afternoon, and promptly fell asleep every time I started, and then decided that instead of flunking yoga, I would succeed in nap taking. So I found that taking a nap at the bottom of the biorhythm at about 4:30 is a way that you can almost divide the day up. It really is almost miraculous the way. And for years I rode roughshod over that period, and it took a real toll on me. So once I inadvertently discovered naps, then that has worked very well for me. Well, I'm a Japan lover. I love its art. And a number of my books have been translated into Japanese. And consequently, I've been invited by Japanese organizations to give talks there, to spend time there. So over the course of a number of years, I've spent a great deal of time in Japan, lecturing, giving seminars and talks, and I feel very much at home in Japan. I like the Japanese, I like their culture, I like everything about the country. I don't know whether this is objectively the case, but the issue that kept on hitting me when I went to Japan was the plight of women, educated women, once they got married. And my impression is that Japanese society has become somewhat less rigid in just opening the way for more flexibility for women. That certainly seems to me to be a major cultural change in any society, and I think particularly for Japan, because it was such an obsolete kind of custom. When you say intercultural, it implies Japanese culture, French culture, Italian culture. But I would define it more broadly than that, because there's an engineering culture, there's a marketing culture, there's a financial culture, there are geographical cultures. And what I have found most striking is over the years I've done a lot of work in the automotive industry and with Detroit. And I think that the problem that Detroit has had, that is doing it in, is this cultural ethnocentricity. There is a Detroit culture, an automotive culture, that is simply not open. It has closed itself off. So whenever you find that, it doesn't have to be intercultural. It can be within a corporation, within an industry. So I think that the problems of intercultural problems have to do with pluralism, have to do with minorities, have to do with being responsive to various stakeholders, not just shareholders. And that's where I think in recent years, business has run into serious difficulty with an ethic of shareholder value. of putting shareholders ahead of all other stakeholders. And I think that's played havoc with the ethics of business and with their potential for success in a world economy. And you know, I'm beginning to see signs that that's wearing out at last, and I hope that it is. I think the issue of sustainability is one of the cultural issues, for example, that our Canadian clients are very concerned with. So from a cultural point of view, in our neighboring Canada, you have more sustainability consciousness than you do in the United States, although it's beginning to move rather quickly here. I think the notion of sustainability is one of the most important concepts, and learning how to deal with it is going to be a major theme of the next 20 years. Well, I think that having an MBA is an important educational achievement. I had no business background whatsoever, and I think that it made life much more difficult for me, knowing almost nothing about financial management. One of the reasons that the organizations that I've started have had success has been my propensity to select difficult, gifted people. And I think that I learned the hard way about managing people. And I think I learned the hard way about what it means to do business in a capitalist society. And an MBA degree is extremely valuable, would have been very valuable for me if I had had that opportunity. Talking. I find other methods of communication fraught with difficulty, especially when you talking across people with different frameworks. If they have different backgrounds, if they come from different divisions or companies. And when you're talking, you can hear what their framework is, and you can respond to it. One of my favorite of the books that I've written is called The Magic of Dialogue. And in genuine dialogue, part of the conversational skill is listening to the assumptions and framework of the other person. And I think that it's very difficult to communicate without that. So, you know, you obviously have to communicate through the written word, through email, through telephone, and so forth. But in terms of preferred mode, it is face-to-face talking. Well, I've always had role models and personal heroes as I've gone along. Some of the people I've worked for and have worked with. I mentioned that I started the public agenda with Cyrus Vance, who was a person of enormous integrity, and I regard him as a role model. A friend of mine, John Gardner, who was at one time Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, and a person of great breadth and thought. Some of the CEOs of companies that on whose boards I've served have had a kind of ethical commitment that I find really worthy of being a role model. I think it's very important to have role models. Well, my favorite business consulting author is Peter Drucker. I think that he had a very special quality of mind, a breadth of thinking that very few writers, current writers on business do have. So he's not necessarily my favorite writer in all the world, but in terms of business writing, he is. Well, walking along this beautiful beach here, being with friends, reading, enjoying life. I think that it would be some of the books that I've written. I guess I've written about 10 books now, and about half of them I regard as achievements that took an enormous amount of effort and discipline, and I felt an enormous sense of relief when I finished them. And also this organization, the not-for-profit public agenda that Vance and I started in 1975 and is still going strong and is doing excellent work with headquarters in New York. So those are some of the achievements that I would be proud of. Almost everything. One of the things, as I said, when I started in business, I didn't know that there was any way you could make a living except work for a salary. I didn't understand the most rudimentary aspects of capitalism. And if I had had that understanding, I would have started at the other end of business, not at the end of the hourly talent for sale, but at the end of venture capitalist, investment banker, some of the more capital. Working with capital in a capitalist society seems to me to make the most sense if you're going to be in business. Well, I think one thing would be to attach themselves to a mentor. It's very important. From the point you have to learn. Most of what you learn is not learned in school or by books. You get a framework from getting, let's say, an MBA. But once you begin to implement that, you need to do it really in relationship to learning from somebody who can take you under their wing and spend time with you, and in exchange for a certain kind of loyalty, help you learn the ropes. And I think next to that, or maybe even ahead of it, these days in particular, to clarify for yourself your own ethical attitude toward work and organization. It seems to me that the most successful entrepreneurs and business people are people who take an attitude of stewardship toward their organization, of the desire to leave the organization better off than when they started. And I think that when you're working with other people, people pick up those signals very quickly. And having that ethical orientation to live by, particularly in business, seems to me that nothing is really more important than clarifying and your own and developing a stewardship, what I would call the stewardship ethos.